You ever get that feeling like something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it? That's exactly how I felt that night, working the closing shift at Jimmy's bar. It was a Thursday, so I wasn't expecting much, just a few regulars nursing their beers and maybe a couple of night owls. The night had been uneventful, almost boring. But looking back, I wish it had stayed that way. It started around 11:30. I had just finished wiping down the counter when I noticed this guy in the corner booth. I swear he hadn't been there a minute ago. Tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. I figured he must have slipped in when I wasn't looking, but something about him seemed off. He was just sitting there, staring at the jukebox, which hadn't worked in years. I could see him tapping his fingers on the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like he was waiting for something. I walked over, trying to shake off the unease. "Hey there, what can I get you?" I asked, my voice sounding cheerier than I felt. He didn't answer right away, just kept tapping his fingers. Then he looked up at me with this half smile, like he knew something I didn't. "Whiskey," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly. I poured him a glass, my eyes never leaving his. He had these dark eyes, the kind that seemed to swallow light. He took the whiskey, didn't drink it, just held it in his hand, swirling it slowly.
Busy night?
He asked, but he wasn't looking at me when he said it. His gaze had drifted back to the jukebox. I shrugged. "Not really. Just winding down, you know? We close in about an hour." He nodded, that weird smile never leaving his face.
Closing time.
He muttered, almost to himself, like it meant something more. I turned away to check on the other patrons, but when I glanced back a moment later, he was gone. The glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table. I decided to check the security cameras. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I needed to see if maybe I'd missed something. I rewound the footage and watched as he appeared on the screen, just like he had at the bar, out of nowhere, like he'd been cut and pasted into the frame. And then I saw something that made my skin crawl. The clock on the screen showed 10:47. Almost an hour earlier than when I'd first seen him. I played the footage again, slower this time, trying to figure out if the cameras were glitching or something. But there he was, sitting in that booth, staring at the jukebox, tapping his fingers. The other customers were still there too, like time had frozen or folded over itself. I checked my watch, it read 12:02. I should have been clearing out the place, locking up. But the footage still showed him there at 10:47. I shut off the monitor and tried to shake it off. Maybe I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to clear the place out, call it an early night. I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't make sense. I didn't hear him leave, didn't see the door open or close. I walked over to the booth, looking around like he might be hiding under the table or something. I know how stupid that sounds, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. The regulars had already gone, and only 2 other people remained, a couple sitting near the door. I walked over to them, but as I got closer, I noticed they weren't moving. Just staring blankly ahead, their eyes glazed over like they were in some kind of trance. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Hey, folks, time to go," I called out, but they didn't even blink. I reached out to touch the guy's shoulder, and his skin felt cold, clammy. Too cold. I pulled my hand back, trying not to panic. That's when I heard it, a low hum coming from the jukebox. I turned around, and it was like the whole room shifted. The lights dimmed, the air thickened, and the jukebox, the damn jukebox that hadn't worked in years, started playing this old, scratchy tune. A song I didn't recognize, something slow and mournful, like a funeral march. And then I saw him again, standing by the bar, that same weird smile on his face. "Closing time," he said, louder this time, like it was an order. The couple by the door stood up, moving in perfect sync, like they were being controlled. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady, but he just kept smiling.
It's not about what I want. It's about what you owe,
he said, taking a step closer. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't care. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. The jukebox kept playing that eerie song, louder now, almost deafening. I felt something cold wrap around my ankle, and I looked down to see a shadow, dark and shifting, crawling up my leg. I panicked and kicked it away, stumbling backward toward the exit. The man just stood there, watching, his eyes now pitch black, like twin voids. "Closing time," he whispered again. And the lights flickered, the room plunging into darkness. I don't remember how I got out, but I did. I found myself outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air biting my skin. I turned around, and the bar was dark, completely still. No music, no lights, no sign of anyone. The cops showed up a few minutes later, but when they checked the place, it was empty. No couple, no mysterious man, nothing. Just an old, abandoned bar with a broken jukebox. They told me it must have been some kind of hallucination, maybe from stress or a gas leak, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I still hear that song. That slow, mournful tune, like a whisper in the dark, reminding me that some things don't end just because you close the door.
I've always been a night owl, but when I took that late-night train from the city, I wasn't expecting to become part of a story I'd never forget. It was a chilly evening in November, the kind where the air feels dense, like it's wrapping itself around you. I had stayed late at the office, working on a project that just wouldn't come together. By the time I made it to the station, the rush hour had long since passed. The platform was eerily empty, just a few stragglers like me, waiting to get home. When the train finally pulled in, it was nearly empty. I chose a seat in the middle of the car, settling into the quiet as we started to move. I was tired, but the kind of tired where your thoughts are still racing, so I kept my eyes open, watching the dark landscape blur past the window. About 20 minutes into the ride, something shifted. I can't explain it exactly, but the air in the car felt different, like the pressure had dropped. I glanced up and noticed the lights flicker, just for a moment. The train was slowing down, but we weren't near a station. We came to a full stop in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods on either side of the track. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I looked around, wondering if anyone else was feeling uneasy, but the car was still mostly empty. Just a few passengers spread out, all of them keeping to themselves. One man sat a few rows ahead, his head resting against the window, eyes closed. Another woman was buried in a book, oblivious to the world around her. Then I saw him, sitting alone at the far end of the car, a man I hadn't noticed before. He was dressed in a long coat, his hat pulled low over his face. Something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he was sitting, perfectly still, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. He didn't seem to have noticed that we'd stopped. He didn't seem to notice anything at all. Minutes passed. The train didn't move. No announcements came over the speakers to explain the delay. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the growing tension in my chest, but something about that man was unsettling. I kept stealing glances at him, hoping he'd do something, check his watch, sigh in frustration, anything, but he didn't move. And then, just as I was starting to convince myself that it was nothing, he turned his head and looked straight at me. His eyes were dark, shadowed under the brim of his hat, but they seemed to lock onto mine with a kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. I quickly looked away, pretending to be interested in something out the window, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The train shuddered and started moving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed. I glanced back at the man, and he had turned back to his original position, staring straight ahead. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. We pulled into the next station, and I half expected the man to get up, but he stayed where he was. A couple of new passengers boarded, and I felt a small wave of relief. The car wasn't quite so empty anymore. I tried to relax, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that it had been a long day and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as we continued on, I noticed something even stranger. The man wasn't the only one acting odd. The other passengers, the man who had been dozing, the woman with the book, had become unnervingly still. They sat like statues, their faces blank, eyes staring straight ahead, just like the man at the end of the car. It was as if they had all simultaneously checked out of reality. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong with these people. I stood up, intending to move to another car, but as I did, the train jolted violently, throwing me off balance. I caught myself on the seat in front of me and looked around in confusion. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the car into brief darkness before they stabilized. When they came back on, my breath caught in my throat. The man at the end of the car was standing now, his hat tilted just enough that I could see his face. He was smiling, but there was something off about it, something almost predatory. And the others, the passengers who had seemed so lifeless, were now all turned in their seats, their eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed through the car, past the unmoving passengers, not daring to look back at the man. My hand shook as I reached for the door at the end of the car, yanking it open and stumbling into the next one. This car was empty, truly empty, but it didn't feel any safer. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the lights above buzzed faintly. I moved quickly, putting as much distance as I could between me and whatever was happening in the previous car. I didn't stop until I reached the front of the train, near the conductor's compartment. I banged on the door, desperate for some kind of human interaction, some explanation for what I had just seen. But there was no answer. I tried the handle, but it was locked tight. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to collect myself. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But as the train sped through the darkness, the feeling of being watched crept back over me. I turned slowly, and there, at the far end of the car, I saw him. The man with the hat. He was standing in the doorway I had just come through, his smile wider now, his eyes gleaming with something that made my blood run cold. He took a step toward me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled the emergency brake. The train screeched in protest, lurching violently as it ground to a halt. I didn't wait. As soon as it stopped, I bolted for the nearest exit, throwing the door open and jumping down onto the tracks. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. The forest loomed around me, dark and silent, but I didn't care. I just kept running, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears, until I couldn't run anymore. I don't know how long I wandered through those woods before I finally found a road. A passing car picked me up, and I must have looked like a madman, rambling about haunted trains and strange passengers. They took me to the nearest town, and I eventually made it home, but I've never set foot on a train since. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in that car, if I hadn't pulled the brake and run. But then I remember the man's smile, and the way those passengers looked at me, and I'm glad I never found out. I never thought cemeteries were all that frightening. They've always been more peaceful to me than anything else. Places where the dead can rest in quiet dignity. That was until one summer evening a few years back, when I had an experience that changed the way I see them forever. I had just started a new job at a landscaping company. One of our contracts was with the city, maintaining a few of the older cemeteries. The one I was assigned to that evening was set on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. It was an old cemetery, the kind that people seem to forget about over time, with tombstones that leaned and crumbled with age. I was there to trim back some of the overgrown trees and bushes that had encroached on the graves. It was late in the day when I arrived, the sun already beginning its descent. The other guys had finished their work earlier and left, but I was assigned the furthest section, the part closest to the tree line. It was isolated, far from the newer graves, which were still occasionally visited by relatives. As I started my work, I noticed how unnervingly quiet it was. I could hear nothing but the steady buzz of insects. No birds, no wind, just that low, constant hum. I chalked it up to the thick trees around me and tried to focus on the task at hand. After about an hour, I had a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It's a difficult sensation to describe, a mix of being watched and not being alone, but more than that, it felt like something was listening. I stopped what I was doing and looked around, but I saw nothing except the endless rows of tombstones and the thickening shadows. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Every time I moved, I felt a presence just out of sight. I started to get uneasy, but I didn't want to leave the job half done. So, I kept working, trying to shake off the anxiety creeping up my spine. As the sun dipped lower, everything was bathed in an orange glow, and the shadows of the tombstones grew long and distorted. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the gravestones nearby didn't cast a shadow. I walked closer, thinking maybe it was just the angle of the light. But no matter how I moved, the stone remained shadowless, standing there as if the sun had no effect on it. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. The tombstone was older than the others, worn and cracked, with the name barely legible. I bent down to take a closer look, running my fingers over the rough stone. The name on it was smoothed out, almost like it had been intentionally erased by time. But there was a date, 1863. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving through the tall grass. I froze, listening. It wasn't just the sound of the breeze or a small animal. It was something deliberate, something heavy. I slowly turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding now, and the thought of leaving crept into my mind. But before I could act on it, the sound grew louder. The grass directly behind the tombstone began to part, flattening down in a line, as if something unseen was walking through it, heading straight toward me. I backed away, nearly tripping over a broken stone. The line in the grass stopped a few feet away from where I stood, the air around me growing cold, almost unnaturally so. It was the middle of summer, but I could see my breath in front of me. I don't know what compelled me to do it, maybe sheer terror, but I looked back at the shadowless tombstone, and I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. There was a small, jagged hole at the base of it, almost as if something had clawed its way out. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. The rustling started again, this time behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing but an undisturbed sea of headstones. I felt a presence now, stronger than before, as if something was right there with me, just inches away. I ran. I didn't care about finishing the job, I just had to get out of there. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist as I sprinted through the rows of graves, each one feeling like it was closing in on me. When I reached the gate, I didn't stop running until I was back in my truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. I wasn't sure they'd believe me, but I never went back to that cemetery, not even when the job required it. I told my boss I'd work any other site, but not that one. I can't explain what I saw, what I felt, but I know it was real. And now, every time I drive past a cemetery, I can't help but wonder what's really lying beneath the surface, what's been forgotten, and what might still be waiting.